This panel is dedicated to international migration in the 21st century, challenges and prospects. It will be mostly dedicated to the plight of refugees and asylum seekers and legal aspects of contemporary migration. This panel is chaired by Daniel Benson, a St. Francis College professor.
So thank you very much for this opportunity to moderate this great panel. The title of the panel is International Migration in the 21st Century, Challenges and Prospects. And so we have 5 speakers. I will introduce them in the order that they speak. And so our first speaker is Jojo Annobil, and his talk is entitled The Central American Humanitarian Crisis and Asylum in the United States. Jojo Annobil is the Executive Director of Immigrant Justice Corps. Prior to his appointment, Jojo was the attorney in charge of the Legal Aid Society's Immigration Law Unit, a citywide leader in the provision of high-quality immigration and legal services. Jojo graduated from Fordham Law School in 1990 and worked at the Legal Aid Society as a staff attorney in the Criminal Appeals Bureau and as a criminal immigration specialist and supervising attorney in the Immigration Law Unit. Jojo is the recipient of the Asian Americans for Equality Agent of Change Award at the Fordham Law School Louis J. Lefkowitz Public Service Award, a New York City Council Proclamation for Outstanding Service to the City of New York, and the New York City Bar Legal Services Award. So many awards, and without further ado.
So good afternoon. We just had lunch. Good afternoon. That's much better. Daniel, thank you so much for that kind introduction. So my topic is dealing with Central America and the asylum process in the United States. And I think all of you have been watching the news and know something about caravans and know something about a wall, know something about borders. And that relates to Central America and the people who are coming from those countries into the United States. I think just before the election, we saw a dispatch of military personnel to the border because there was a caravan coming out of Honduras, a caravan of about 7,000 estimated people, and we sent 5,000 to the border as if we're expecting a space war. And then we also saw the closing down of the government for about 35 days, just because there has to be a wall to prevent people from coming in. The Central American humanitarian crisis is nuanced, but at its core, it's a simple problem of children, parents with children, fleeing atrocities, gun violence, domestic violence, extortion, who only want safety and protection, which is a human right to seek safety and human protection. If your country cannot provide that, that is the core of the problem. And international law and our own laws in the United States indicates that when someone shows up at our border and seeks protection, there are processes that they have to go through. So this problem came to its fore probably somewhere around 2014 when it reared its ugly head and we saw an influx of children coming into the country. That year, about 68,000 children from Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador made their way here, traveling thousands of miles. At the same time, about 68,000 parents and children also made that journey. Since 2014, those numbers have fluctuated. The numbers for children have gone down a bit, never gotten up to the 68,000 mark, but somewhere around 50,000. The numbers for parents with children coming has risen from that 68,000 to 107,000 last year. When you look at the flows at ports of entry, back in 2000, we had about 1.6 million illegal crossings. that number has gone down tremendously to about 500,000 now. But yet still all you hear about is building a wall and keeping people out. Why do they come? I just mentioned a bit of it, gang violence. But it used to be that the children kept coming because a lot of these children were coming to reunite with parents who had left because of environmental disasters and armed conflict years ago. Left with grandparents who have since aged and couldn't take care of them. So coming to reunite. They came, they walked, some took trains, bullet trains through Mexico, were maimed, fell off the trains because they slept whilst on those journeys, dangerous journeys. And some lost their lives. So in looking at this crisis, it's great to look at how our government has responded to this crisis. So let's look basically at the point of 2014 to 2018. Sorry, 2014 to 2016 during the Obama administration. When there was this influx of children back then, the Obama administration was looking to gain or repair the broken immigration system, looking for broad expansion or broad outlines to repair the system. And so looking to the legislature basically to come with them on this journey. So with this influx, he had to show toughness. And by showing toughness was basically detaining these families, putting them through what they call credible fear hearings. He also basically put them through fast-track courts, meaning that even though they are allowed to come into the country, they are still in removal proceedings or deportation proceedings. And instead of putting them in deportation proceedings in the same track, basically put them on a fast track. Slow down all the other cases and said we have to process these cases quicker because the idea was that they'll be able to return them back to their countries. And so between 2014 and 2016, there were these fast-track courts. You could have about 105 children in court on any day, and there's no right to appointed counsel in immigration. Unlike the criminal justice system, or unlike someone who jumps a turnstile, and if you can't afford a lawyer, you get one. In immigration, you do not get one. You have to find your own lawyer. Yes, you have a right to have a lawyer, but it's not a government expense. So even if you're 2 years old, 3 years old, and you're in removal proceedings, you have to be the one to represent yourself unless you get a lawyer. So that caused a lot of problems because in certain jurisdictions, unlike New York, you don't have access to free legal services. But that was the plan of the Obama administration. They also tried to reach out to the Mexican government to try and get them to stop the children from coming. At the same time, they also thought that they had to repair some of the infrastructure in these three countries. And so voted about $750 million or $75 million to repair these things. Now, when we talk about why these people come, why the children come, why the parents with children come, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras are amongst the highest, have the highest homicide rates in the world. There's a lot of violence on women and children. Fast forward to 2015, 2016, towards the election. Candidate Trump talked about immigrants coming across the border, murderers, rapists, but all that talk was referring back to 2000 because Mexicans have stopped coming in the numbers they used to come. Mexicans have actually been leaving, going back home. The problem at the border had to do with people coming from Central America and other countries. And so the approach had to be different. But the candidate's approach was we will get tough. So in the first few months of the Trump administration, there was this whole talk of if you come, we will send you back. And we will no longer adopt a catch and release. I don't like that phrase because catch and release is really used for fishes. You catch them and you release them, not human beings. But that is something that we use, or the government uses uses to describe human beings, right? So the attitude back in 2017 was, we will detain you if you come, which was basically following the footsteps of the Obama administration of detaining family units. So they started doing that. So the first 3 months of 2007, the numbers went down a bit. And there was this whole talk of, this is how you do it. Tough talk, people don't come. Well, they started coming. And when they started coming, the government decided that there had to be deterrence. And the deterrence policy they decided on was something called a zero tolerance policy. A zero tolerance policy basically was that anyone who came into the country illegally would be prosecuted under a misdemeanor statute, which basically means that instead of being in immigration proceedings, you are transferred into federal criminal proceedings, whether for a day or a week. You take a plea and you get placed back in immigration proceedings. But what also happened was, the trick was that once they separate the parent, they put the parent in criminal proceedings, the child who is left behind is deemed to be an unaccompanied minor. And that child is transferred to the Health and Human Services Department or the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so there was that break. Once the parent got back into immigration proceedings and immigration detention, the child was gone. Based on litigation that we've seen so far, we see that the government kept no records of where these kids went to or who their parents were. And so through litigation, when it came to a point where the government was being asked to reunite these kids, it became an issue, became a problem. But how do you separate kids from their parents? I thought we are a country based on family integration, family unity. So how do we do that? That process started somewhere around September 2017. Most of us didn't hear about it until probably May, when there was a huge uproar. Meanwhile, there was litigation going on on this issue. And so the president issued an executive order stopping this practice, which we hear still happens, and also said, we will jail you indefinitely once we reunite you with your child. Well, you can't do that because there's something called the Flores Settlement. The Flores Settlement, F-L-O-R-E-S, says that the government cannot detain a child for more than 20 days in adult detention facilities. So you can't do that. So once there were lots of challenges on this, the government had to pivot. And the way they did that was to attack our asylum laws. Under our asylum laws, anyone can present themselves at a port of entry and ask for asylum. Or if you happen to be in this country, ask for asylum based on certain things. One, that you are afraid of going back to your country because of a well-founded fear of present or future persecution, or even past, based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group, or political opinion. What the former Attorney General did was to take a case of a woman from El Salvador who had been granted asylum based on domestic violence. She had suffered severe emotional, mental, and physical abuse from her husband. A woman with 3 children who couldn't flee from that relationship. And so they were deemed to be members of a particular social group. The Attorney General recertified this case to himself, which he can do under immigration policy, and decided that anyone who is seeking asylum and the perpetrator is not a government entity cannot be granted asylum. That has never been our law. That has never been our law. And extending it to gun violence. So of course it was challenged, which is what has been happening around the country for the past 2 years. The government makes rules, we challenge those rules, we get injunctions, it's put on the back burner, they rewrite the laws, and we go on. But the Central American issue is interesting because every turn the government has done something different. The other thing the government did was to issue a presidential proclamation, basically saying that if you enter the country without inspection, without showing yourself as at a border entry, then you cannot apply for asylum. Who said so? The law doesn't say that. The president can implement immigration laws. Immigration laws are written by Congress. And Congress has indicated that anyone can apply for asylum either at the border or whilst they come into the country. So of course, it was thrown out as unconstitutional. Now today, what you have is a policy of stay or return to Mexico, the migration protocols policy, which is that if you show up at the border, we will ask you to take a ticket, return to Mexico, and wait there for 45 days. Then we'll call you to show up at the border. You will come and see an immigration judge and determine whether you have a credible fear of returning to your country. This is a country that the president had said in 2015 as a candidate, that's a dangerous country. They send dangerous people here. So why are we sending asylum seekers back to Mexico? You have situations where now parents are writing their names in black marker pens and their information on their children's bodies because the children may be separated from them. Those are not American ideals. American ideals of compassion, liberty, justice does not require us to do this. We've been a moral leader when it comes to immigration for a very long time. The Central American issue is something that we all have to rise up and talk about it and indicate that it's not just. The separation of families is something that's happening at the border, but can happen here. It happened here in Brooklyn, where a woman's child was taken away from it. We all saw those pictures with the woman on the floor. Where did those law enforcement people have that idea? Probably because they had an idea of it's happening at the border. But these deterrent policies by both the Obama administration and by the Trump administration have not worked. There's a need for the Western Hemisphere countries to come together because these parents and children and also children are not only coming to the US, they are going to other countries like Costa Rica. There needs to be a policy where we address this issue. There has to be some humanitarian aid to these three countries to allow them to improve their infrastructures, to allow them to help set up their law enforcement agencies so that gangs do not take over those cities. There's a need for in-country processing for refugees. So it's an issue that if it hasn't come, if it's not on your radar, I'm sure you've heard of caravans. They come in caravans because if they come alone, they are preyed upon. Women, probably 80% of women who make that journey are sexually assaulted. This afternoon, all I'm leaving you with the Central American issue is it's an issue in our backyard. Yes, there are things happening around the world. America needs to rise up and do what is right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jojo, for that presentation. We will save questions for the end, so after all five speakers have spoken, so save your questions for the end. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Yassin El-Ayouty, St. Francis College professor. Yassin El-Ayouty is founder and president of Sun's Globe, Global Training in the Rule of Law, a non-profit devoted to transnational judicial and legal training. He served the UN from 1954 to 1986, including being UN spokesman during the Algerian War of Independence. He has published many, many books, 14 I believe. His two most recent books are Fighting Jihadism by Ideology, The New Religious Islamic Revolution, and Perspectives on Egypt, Islam, in the Dark Era of Trump.
Thank you very much, and I'm honored to have been invited to my dear college, St. Francis, with which I have been associated for the past 21, 22 years, and to be your partner of this August panel. In this regard, I'd like to allow me to salute the leadership of the Egyptian Culture Club that took the trouble of coming here all the way, and starting with Tariq Suleiman, the president of the club. He has a way of disappearing when you need him. He's the next in line, and Abla Karim. And I have been honored to be made Abla. I've been asked to be the honorary chairman or president of that club. Now, coming to my topic, I'd like to say that immigration and faith have been historically intertwined with human destiny. There are all kinds of reasons for migration, as has been indicated by my brother, the distinguished Jojo. Being afraid of your environment, so you seek asylum. Being hopeful for bettering your future, so you are an economic refugee. Being desirous of establishing something new, so you are a nation builder. Being a seeker of influencing others by their religious or political faith, you are an advocate. Finally, being an advocate of innovation, so you are an agent of change. No country is ever full. This counters President Trump's attempt to falsely describe his hastily or hostility toward immigration. It is racism, but with a contrived label that says America first. In fact, it means America, from Trump's point of view, is for the whites only. If not, then why establish a Muslim ban, yet call for immigrants from Norway? The President of the United States call it Norway because he doesn't read. The absence of an American immigration policy is an affront to the Statue of Liberty, to the founders of this republic, and to the values of diversity on which progress is anchored. There's a reason for Jewish Passover, flight for faith preservation. There's a reason for the Holy Family's flight to Egypt, the same motivation. There is a reason for Muslims to date their calendar with the immigration called Hijrah. It is now the year 1440. Now, as a matter of fact, in Islamic dogma, the Quran, which is the Bible for Muslims, says, makes it a religious duty to migrate. It says those who accepted oppression for themselves, surely when the angels have indicated that to them, why have you accepted this oppression? They shall say, we were deemed to be weak. The angels shall say, as the Quran states, God's earth is spacious enough to have you flee from that type of aggression. Now I come to the question posed in this program with regard to, is there a consensus on immigration? There is no consensus. Why? Because it is a question of who is a migrant and who is a refugee is not really well defined. This complexity I found during the Algerian War of Independence, where I was spokesman during that very dangerous period of history. We now have an international document sanctioned by heads of state and government in Morocco on December 10 and 11 of past year, called Global Compact for Safe, orderly, and regular migration. The document largely rests on the United Nations Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, and the United Nations Conventions. There are two of them that are very important. One is the civil and political rights, and the second is the economic, social, and cultural rights, both of 1966. There are other important instruments on which the compact rests, including two important conventions, namely transnational organized crime, and the other is the Slavery Convention. In all these instruments, there is one basic principle, which is that the refugees and migrants are entitled to the same universal human rights and fundamental freedoms. What is a right? What is a right? Legally, a right is a value on which you can go to court to sue for the protection of this right. In this regard, the Global Compact does not go beyond what it calls global dialogue, international cooperation and migration. Nothing is there with regard to implementation. Now, the vagueness is also reflected in the document subtitles. These subtitles indicate lack of teeth for enforcement, such as our vision, guiding principles, shared responsibilities, unity of purpose. These are blah, blah, blah in terms of enforcement. They mean nothing. They mean zip. So as a result of this, we have an international situation where our basic rights have been eroded by the rise of the right and of nativism and of chauvinism here in this country, as well as in Europe, as well as other parts of Southeast Asia. Now, obviously, the entire compact is anchored in international human rights law. I don't want to be a lawyer at this panel by delving into the mechanics of the law, but just to give you a flavor of the spirit. There's something called international human rights law and something that's called international humanitarian law. The latter is the product of the Nazi trials in Nuremberg of 1945, followed by the Tokyo military trials of 1946. These two sets of trials have set the tone, the entire tone of what we have today. Namely, if you are in a course and your boss orders you to do something illegal, you must say no. If you don't say no, you are culpable, you are complicit, and this is why we find in today, as an example in today's New York Times, the President of the United States, who doesn't read, floats the idea that he is going even to ignore subpoenas of the court, of any court, or of Congress. Obviously, you have to remember that the Constitution of the United States is made of 3 articles. Article 1 is Congress, Article 2 is the executive, and Article 3 is the judiciary. So what had the present administration done? Because this has eventually an impact on the entire question of immigration, as my distinguished predecessor in presentation have said, is that you have to abide by the legislative authority. Because the legislative authority is us. We have voted for representatives to go to speak for us. This is a representative democracy. It has weaknesses, but it has survived. It has glitches, such as the way we vote. When I vote, I'm of 2 nationalities, an Egyptian and an American. When I vote for any voting situation or plebiscite in Egypt, my vote is counted directly. When I vote in the United States, it is not counted directly. because it has to go through a sieve called the Electoral College. The Electoral College is like the appendix in your body that has existed there, but it has no function. Who are these people who take my vote and do what they want with it? They can go to Las Vegas with it. They can go to Paris. They can come here and have nice stuff from Sahada here on Atlantic Avenue or have hummus or baba ganoush. I don't know them, but my vote goes to them. I have surrendered my vote to an electoral college. And then they say, oh, but this is the Constitution. Duh. Well, the Constitution of the United States is a human document. Every human document is subject to change. And I have taught the law of treaties in various law schools, the last one of which is Fordham University School of Law. And you know, in the law of treaties, that when circumstances changes, then the law has to change. So you get great scholars like Tribe at Harvard who says, you got to amend the Constitution of the United States. And you have people who are now saying, no, you cannot do that, because to do that, you have to go through a process of amendment that takes years. Guess what? The Trump administration in 2 years has inflicted on this great country of ours so much harm that it may take at least 2 decades to squash all the debris that has accumulated in our midst. I would like to end up, in order to be within the time, by saying that the global compact that has been promulgated in Morocco really lacks effectiveness, and I would like to say that we have to understand that whatever the Trump administration does with regard to what is happening today, especially at the border, a border that Trump has declared is a national emergency. Where is the national emergency? Where is the national emergency? I mean, Professor Jojo had indicated that there are points of entry, there are points of asylum. People are coming in. They are coming in the right way. Why send them back? You are sending them back to where they have suffered. The countries of Central America are in total disarray. And if you want to read a good book about what's happening today, whether it has to do with immigration or anything else, just read the book by Richard Haas, the president of the Foreign Affairs Policy, or Foreign Affairs. It is called A World in Disarray, Immigration. I'm glad that this has been arranged here at this great college. It's a complex issue. I'm very glad that it has been called an inaugural, because I'm quite sure there will be great sequels that will provide you with more information than my debris of information which I have shared with you. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor El-Ayouty. Moving on to our third speaker, Joseph Guirguis, whose talk is entitled Immigration and Unauthorized Practice of Law. Joseph Guirguis is an immigration legal assistant at the law offices of Anne Z. Zedke in New York. He assists clients with accurate completion of immigration application forms and provides clients with comprehensive legal service for all immigration matters. Joseph holds a Master of International Law, Bachelor's degree in Law, and Graduate Diploma of International Negotiations from Egypt. He is a member of the Egyptian Bar Association, Federation of Arab Lawyers, the Egyptian Society of International Law, and associate of Sons Club. So please, Joseph.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. It is my honor and my pleasure to be here today. Actually, San Francisco College is a special place for me, as when I came to the US first time 7 years ago, San Francisco College was one of my first places I have visited with Dr. El-Ayouty. Thank you, Dr. El-Ayouty. When Professor Helena gave me the honor to be one of the speakers today, I was thinking about the subject can I talk about. The immigration and unauthorized practice of law was my choice for 2 reasons. First, I work in immigration field, and I see in my community many people offering immigration services, and they are unauthorized to do that. The second, because I am myself unauthorized to practice law in US, I practice law in my other country, Egypt. United States is made up of immigrants, and people believe that the country offers lots of opportunities. However, it is not easy to immigrate to the United States. There are different ways to immigrate to the USA, and the ones looking to immigrate must be aware of the requirements and the options. Really, everyone wants to come to the US. So first, I will go through the most popular ways to immigrate to the US. The first way is the family-based immigration. Family immigration is a primary basis for the legal immigration to the United States. Under current immigration law, US citizens and lawful permanent residents can sponsor certain family members for a visa that provides permanent residence, also known as a green card. These relatives are organized into groups referred as preference categories, and they are categorized according to the relation that qualifies for the immigrant's visa. Except the immediate relative of the US citizen, they always have immigrant visas available. Under this preference system, these beneficiaries may have to wait for several years after the visa petition is approved before they can actually immigrate. The petitioner here is the US citizen or the green card holder. He is a person who is seeking for immigration services, and he started the petition process, so he is a victim of unauthorized practice of law if he deals with non-attorney or non-accredited representative. So not only the newcomers could be the victims of unauthorized practice of law, the US citizen and the green card holder could be too. The second popular way to immigrate to the USA is the diversity visa program, also known visa lottery. One of the more unique ways to entering the US is through the diversity visa lottery program. Every year, the government gives out 50,000 visas randomly to people who live in country with low immigration numbers to the US. The visa lottery was created by the Immigration Act of 1990 as a channel for immigrants from countries with low rates of immigration to the US. An applicant must submit the entry of the DV lottery program online each year between October 3rd and November 7th. And there is no cost to apply. Really, this is the cheapest and easy way to immigrate to the US, but only the lucky ones got it. The winner of the visa lottery are chosen at random by computer program with a certain number of visas each region of the world. Once the immigrant comes to the USA, he should receive his green card by mail, but he still may need immigration services. So sometimes delays happen to receive his green card, his social security card, and he could be a victim of the people offering immigration services, and they are unauthorized to practice of law. The third popular way to immigrate to the US is the refugees. 2/3 of refugees worldwide come from just 5 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Myanmar, and Somalia. Refugees are the people who fled their home for several reasons, including persecution or the fear of persecution and the war, to find protection elsewhere. Individuals who left their native countries to avoid persecution can apply for refugee status through the US embassy outside of their home country. I believe that the refugees are the most popular category, that they may need help in immigration services, and they could be victims of unauthorized practice of law. There are many non-profit organizations helping refugees. Later, I will have a short brief about the non-profit organizations and how they are helping refugees in immigration services. United States always opens the door for refugees. Albert Einstein was a refugee. and the door is still open. As we see nowadays, refugees coming from some countries have a bad conditions. Really, the number of refugees has been reduced, but the door is still open. Some people walking miles and miles to find safety. Imagine being an immigrant, speaking a little or no English, and have to navigate the immigration system. Refugees are the most people they may need help in immigration services. I just got these photos from the website of International Rescue Committee. As I had my 2 years of internship with them, really very great organization, and I saw how they are helping the refugees. Now is the question, who is providing immigration service to all these categories, and who cannot, or who can practice law and who cannot? The immigration law is complex, and many people look for help when dealing with immigration authorities. Unfortunately, there are individuals and organizations who may promise you more than is legal and charge for services they cannot provide. Before you hire someone to help you with immigration issues, it is important to understand exactly who can help you and what they can legally do. There are a number of categories of authorized individuals who may engage in practice of immigration law and represent others in immigration matters. This list includes lawyers, law students, and law graduates under supervision of licensed attorney and accredited representative. First, the lawyer. The lawyer admitted to the bar to any state in the United States can practice immigration law because immigration law is a federal law. Lawyers can practice and appear in the court and before immigration agents in any of the 50 states so long as they are a member in a good standing of at least one state bar. However, lawyers practicing in a state where they are not licensed must be careful not to give advice concerning other areas of law that often intersect the immigration law as criminal or family law as that would be constitute unauthorized practice of law. The second category can practice immigration law is the accredited representative. The U.S. Department of Justice agents licensed to special training non-lawyers known as accredited representative who work for non-profit organizations to provide immigration legal service to low-income clients. The accredited representative work can only be done through the PIA-recognized organization, which must go through an application process to demonstrate it has enough resources and supervisory staff with immigration law expertise. The recognized organization is non-profit, relation, social service, or similar organization with authority from the PIA, which is the Board of Immigration Appeals. An accredited representative may not provide immigration services at any organization except the one he is affiliated and work with. The other non-lawyer authorized in immigration cases are the law student and law graduates. Is not a lawyer yet and not admitted to the bar. They must work under supervision of lawyers and accredited representative. They must obtain a permission from Immigration Court of the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and may not receive any fees from the client. But now, how to verify if the attorney or accredited representative is legally present you before the USCIS? An attorney must be in a good standing with U.S. State Bar Association. You can contact the State Bar Admission Office to verify his information. An accredited representative must work for an organization that has permission from the Board of Immigration Appeals to provide legal services in immigration matters. What is the unauthorized practice of law? The unauthorized practice of law is offering legal services without being licensed as attorney, giving advice about a document a client needs, provide legal assistance to applicants or petitioners in immigration matters, and the person holds themselves out to be qualified in legal matters. But the general information, we cannot consider it as a legal advice or unauthorized practice of law. Here is some examples that do not constitute actual legal advice. The legal information obtained from free online websites, advice from friends or family, information you hear in the radio, information you read on social media's website like Facebook, information you see in the news, and response to legal questions posted in online Q&A boards. Who cannot practice immigration law? Many immigrants seek the assistance of professionals to help them navigate the complex U.S. immigration system. Unfortunately, some immigrants have fallen to unauthorized practitioners of immigration law, sometimes known as notarios, who have created a public safety crisis in many communities. Typically, these people have a little or no training at all in immigration law, and they often charge high fees for unnecessary work, refuse to return documents to the client, and threaten to report their client's immigration status to authorities. The notarious action can cause immigrants to spend thousands of dollars, lose potential opportunities for immigration benefits, or even be deported. Only lawyers licensed by the bar may perform the immigration service. Non-lawyers, the notarios, may not. Notarios cannot provide any legal services, including selecting the filings out for immigration forms, unless they are transcribing the information onto form pre-selected by client without providing any explanation what information is being requested. Notarios cannot represent you on immigration matters. You can always represent yourself before the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. Only lawyer or accredited representative may communicate on your behalf about your application with USCIS. Notarios cannot do this. Notarios cannot give you a legal advice. The legal advice is how to answer questions on your immigration forms and what immigration options you may have. New York law has a section dedicated to immigration assistance services, which prohibits notarios from acting as a lawyer or holding themselves out to be in a contact with a legal services. Now I will talk about the difference and the confusion between the notary publics and notarios. In certain countries, especially in Latin America, but also elsewhere, notarios are allowed to provide legal services. Unscrupulous individuals in the United States prey on the confusion between the notarios in other countries and notary publics in the United States. This confuses community members into thinking the notarial public has the lawful ability to assist with immigration matters. In the US, the notary is an individual just appointed by the state government to witness signing the document. A notary may not prepare the legal document or act as a legal advisor unless he or she is a licensed attorney. In many countries, like South America, the notary public is an attorney. He drafts this document and he provides legal advice. The notaries can delay immigration matters and treat the ability of non-citizens to successfully qualify for immigration benefits. But the notary public can still help in immigration matters as he provides assistance in different ways. One of the most popular ways is a translation, as the document must be translated to English, like birth certificate, marriage certificate, and any other document is not originally in English. And you need to submit it to USCIS. It must be in English and the notary can translate it. Transcribe. Notary can fill out the application form without providing any explanation what kind of information is being requested. He can help and obtain marriage certificate, birth certificate, make an appointment for biometrics or what's called fingerprints, and he can refer the client to immigration authority. He can contact or make classes for English language and civic classes for prepare clients for citizenship interview. So the notary can help in immigration, but we should be careful of what kind of help he can do. And we have to be careful to do not be a victim on immigration fraud. The Executive Office of Immigration Review issued an import notice in 2009. If you need help with your immigration case, watch out for persons who pretend to be immigration lawyer or accredited representative. They can take too much money, involve person in immigration fraud, and get them deported or arrested. To protect yourself from immigration fraud, the Executive Office of Immigration Review determined what to do and what you cannot do. You cannot sign, or you have to be careful to do not sign blank application. Do not sign application you don't understand what on it, and do not sign application as a false information because it's going to affect you, and do not pay any fees without getting a receipt. What you should do, you should get a copy of your application because sometimes you need this copy to review what information you put on it before your interview with USCIS. Do check if the person can represent you, and do reports complain about the notarius who practice law. We have to be careful of immigration fraud. Fraudulent promises to expedite process. This type of fraud concerns individuals who pretend that they know employees at the immigration offices who can expedite the process for their client applications. And they request very high fees for this special service, but they fail to provide it. The misinformation fraud. Under this type of fraud, a provider will typically provide inaccurate information or false information to the immigrant concerning his eligibility for adjustment of status under particular law. In these cases, the immigrant is usually not aware what he or she has been a victim of fraud until they receive a letter of ineligibility from immigration authorities. However, the provider knows that the immigrant is not entitled to relief or ineligible, but he will still file the application with immigration authorities regardless. We should take action. We should take action. Please take action if you fell a victim, because we need to stop or at least eliminate the unauthorized practice of law. If you have a complaint about a notarius or immigration consultant, contact your local bar association, consumer advocate, or take advice from the prosecutor. Cannot afford a lawyer. Maybe the lawyer will get upset with me now. Sometimes, especially for the new immigrants, they cannot offer a legal fees. That's why they are trying to find non-lawyers to help them, and now the door is open for the notarius. Unfortunately, the government doesn't provide free lawyers in immigration cases. Generally, you must hire your own lawyers or represent yourself. But there are some options out there. People may get help from an accredited non-profit organization for small fee or even free of charge. The non-profit legal immigration service provider offering a very good help. The best example for non-profit legal immigration service provider is the International Rescue Committee. Is an international non-profit organization founded in 1933 at the request of Albert Einstein. The comprehensive immigration service for the IRC are available in 23 US cities and are provided by qualified staff. The IRC can provide eligibility consultation, legal representation, and full case management service. Over the past 5 years, the IRC New Jersey office, because as I mentioned before, I had my 2 years of my internship over there. This office has helped file more than 200 applications for individuals to become a US citizen and more than 321 applications for legal permanent residency. The IRC charges nominal fees for the immigration services. The second example for the nonprofit legal immigration service provider is CUNY Citizenship Now. CUNY Citizenship Now is provided free and high quality of immigration services to help individuals and the family on their path to US citizenship. The volunteer lawyers assist at the citizenship application assistance events held throughout New York City on Saturdays twice a month. At these events, the volunteer work one-on-one with application helping the applicant in complete the N400 application for citizenship that's completely for free. In the end, I would like to thank for attending the conference and listening to me, and please share information if you find it useful. Thank you very much.
Born in Argentina, Roberta has a long-standing interest in the politics of social inequalities and has been committed to actively work for justice within and across geographical and social borders. She has written several books. Her first book is entitled Violence Against Latina Immigrants, Citizenship, Inequality, and Community in 2010, and Memory, Truth, and Justice in Contemporary Latin America. And she's working on a book manuscript entitled Inequalities, Migration, and Health, Critical Activist Research Across Ecuadorian Borders. So please join me in welcoming Professor of Villalon.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. It's an honor to be here. I am from Argentina, but I work at St. John's University in the other side of this little border between Brooklyn and Queens. And we're having our immigration conference, I think is next week or the following, so you're all welcome to join us there too. So today what I'm going to try to do is share some of the main findings of this research project that I've been working for the last, I guess, 3 to 4 years. That's based on the case of Ecuadorian migration, mostly Ecuadorians who went to Spain and the United States and also Italy, and also what happened to the relatives of these Ecuadorian migrants who stayed in Ecuador. So, all right. So what's the main problem here that we found? We know that migration processes affect our health, both mentally and physically. And not just of the migrants themselves, but also the relatives who stay behind. And in terms of looking at how these migration processes affect their health, we also know that there's an impact in public health in the countries of origin, countries of transit, and then the countries of destination. We also know that migration journeys have become more risky and more precarious, and this has caused different types of effects and more consequences in both mental and physical entirety of migrants themselves. We also know that the conditions where people are coming from are worsening, and this is some of what we've heard earlier in this panel and before in the morning. And we also know that we have increasingly anti-immigration environments, contexts where migrants are going to. So all of these have only worsened how the well-being of migrants are affected with these migration processes. Now, despite the fact that we know these two things, what we also encounter is that health policies and migration policies are not really talking to each other. So what we have, both at the national level and at the international level, is a lack of communication between those policymakers concerned with health issues and policymakers concerned with migration issues. This is also reflected in how those providing services for migrants and those providing health services in general have very little awareness of how these two issues are connected. Most of them know about it in practice, but very few of them have been formed in this way. So what we find usually is, even though health practitioners and migration service providers have very good intentions, they know very little about the connection of these two, and usually end up providing poorer services than they could have if they knew about this matter. So in this context, as I was invited to join the Institute for Health and Migration of a hospital in the southern area of Ecuador, and we started doing this research there, mostly because of rising rates of emigration of Ecuadorians to Spain, United States and Italy, and then high rates of return migration. So the way in which we approached this research was mostly based on all these grassroots efforts and social movements efforts to address this issue of how migration affects health and how little we know and how little is being done about this matter. Now, in this context, the way in which we worked for it was to think about how we could do a study, we could do research that would have an implication, that we could apply to the migrant communities, to policymakers, to health providers, to doctors and health providers who were interested in working better and providing better services for them. So the way in which we designed this project was really in an activist way, with an agenda that was very clear to improve the living conditions and the health conditions of migrants and their relatives. The other characteristic, I'm sorry I keep turning around, but I don't have it written here, so I keep turning, sorry about that. The other characteristic of our research is that it was not just transnational, but that I was bringing in a sociological perspective. So what we had found in the literature was that most of the research that we had on this matter was either done from a medical perspective, from an epidemiological perspective, or psychological one, or the legal or policy type of perspective. But none of them had a more comprehensive understanding, and that was part of the objective of this work, to see how important it was to think about this comprehensively from a sociological perspective that took into account all of these inequalities, social inequalities that affected and caused migration processes and affected the ways in which migrants were treated while they were in their journeys and then when they arrived to the different countries of destination. The other point that we made sure to keep in mind when we were doing this work was to be interdisciplinary in the way we thought about this issue, as well as think about it critically to try to bring in new light to this matter. All right, there's a lot of things written there. All right, so some of the research questions we wanted to address had to do with the systems of inequality that have been described usually within migration literature as pushing people out of their countries in search for better living conditions, right? So usually when we think about inequalities in sociology, we think about how they intersect, how our racial and ethnic background intersect with our nationality, with our social class, with our gender, etc., etc. And we were looking at how these inequality systems were literally kind of accompanying migrants through their journeys and then becoming part or being challenged and transformed once they arrived to a different country, right? So we were thinking about how was that our awareness and our way of dealing with these systems of inequality where we live, right, regardless of where we're at, how is it that they change over time and in space, and how these can affect, again, in this case, our health and our well-being. The way in which we looked into some of these and paying attention always to individuals' agency, right, the capacity that immigrants have to deal with decisions and do otherwise, was by looking at the experiences of migrants and their relatives through surveys, in-depth interviews, group focus as well, like group interviews, community workshops with migrant populations, as well as training training sessions with health providers and migrant service providers, where we collected data to think about and texturize, right? Where were these experiences? The statistics that we have about how health is affected by migration are there, but they're a little bit limited in terms of many migrants being irregular migrants and not going through the, say, traditional channels of health provision. Also because there's some, let's say, sample bias in terms of how and who are the people that are taking into account. So we really wanted to understand this more qualitatively and understand the experiences that they had. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about the highlights of the findings that came up of this work. So we are in conversation, of course, with the literature on this issue. So some of these concepts already existed, and we were thinking or looking to see how they apply to the study that we were doing, and with the case of Ecuadorian migrants that were always looked at in the context of Latin American migration, both to the US and to Spain. And the first one was this reconceptualization or questioning of what has been called the healthy migrant effect. And the healthy migrant effect was the idea that when they looked, this was basically done in the United States, and this study measured that migrants had better health outcomes than native populations, people living in the US already that were originally from here. And part of this explanation was to say that the reason why this was the case, even though they were living under working under exploitative conditions or living under difficult, environments, they were healthier because they were coming into the United States young and ready to work in the best years of their lives, and they were, say, stronger physically. And that was kind of the idea behind why they had these better health outcomes. There were also some studies about this, looking at the fact that many of these migrants who were so healthy eventually went back home when they got sick and they were older, so we couldn't really calculate people actually getting ill and getting sick and dying in the US, so that's why they had less mortality rates than people from the US. And there were also other hypotheses there trying to say how important it was for immigrants, for example, to live with other immigrants in different areas and depending on the city, and how this could have presented an advantage culturally to prevent them from becoming sick or taking on some, let's say, unhealthy behaviors more typical of the US. However, when we look at the case of Ecuadorians, both in the US and Ecuador and Spain, what we saw was that it was true that some of them had left Ecuador healthy and young, but that very, very quickly they became sick and their health started deteriorating. And part of the reason, of course, as they were talking about this already today, and as you know, had to do with how strenuous the journey is and how much violence and how much physically challenging and mentally challenging it's becoming to do these migration processes. But the other part, of course, had to do with the fact that most of these migrants are working in exploitative conditions. They're working without insurance in most cases. They go through different type of accidents, and none of this gets treated properly because of the cost of health treatment. And even in Spain, where there's insurance and they have other capacities to do it, this also affects, there's also not so much of a willingness to go through an entire medical treatment, because there's that need to be able to be back at work and producing and sending money back home. So what we saw was that really this idea that the migrants are healthier and that they have better health outcomes is really biased and is not very much describing the reality, which has been noted by this idea that migrants are healthy but are vulnerable, right? And that they're very much at risk to deteriorating in terms of their mental and physical health. The other point that we brought up was related to what has been labeled as the salmon bias, which is this idea that people, as I mentioned earlier, when they get older and they are ill, they go back home because they want to die at home. And the idea of the salmon, the parallel with that is just simply because that's what this fish does. When they're getting old, they go back to where they started, all right? And so when we're looking at that, and there's a lot to this critique, but I just want to point to one important idea, which is to reconceptualize this based on how much of the return that migrants have done was reflexive, and it didn't have to do necessarily with being sick or dying, but it had to do with more of an assessment of what had happened to them and what was the right time to go back home to live for a certain amount of years, in many cases decades, right? Even if in some cases they might have been sick, but they were also looking for the health treatment and the cultural, right, cultural awareness that was necessary for them to feel better and to enjoy the rest of their lives better. And together with this idea of the reflexive return that gives more agency, right, to the immigrant, that it's not just that they're going back to die, but they're going back because they know it's the best thing they can do for themselves, and then to live there for a certain amount of years. How many times? 5 minutes, that's good. We also distinguish between returns that were forced and returns that were reflexive. And then we looked into the shock of returning as another process where migration is, it puts us at risk our health and our entity our identity and our entity as emotional and mental beings. Okay, so I'm gonna push for a couple more that I think are important. The other thing that we got engaged with in this study had to do with this notion of resilience that has become more and more popular when talking about migrants and health, right? Where there's this emphasis in the strength that migrants have in coping with and becoming stronger from the process of migrating. And in our research, what we found was that it was clear that there was a strength and that there was a very strong attitude against the odds that migration had put forth to most immigrants. But when we asked about what they felt in terms of their strength, they did not agree with describing themselves as resilient. Instead, they agreed with describing themselves as resistant because they continued to see themselves at risk. So there was this sense that their condition and their, let's say, the precarity, even though they might have achieved social mobility and maybe they were fine in terms of their documents or their economics, they always felt that there was a risk and there was a precarious condition about their immigration status, both in Spain and in the United States. So part of the discussion had to do with how is it that we're conceptualizing, right, the resistance or the strength that migrants have. And I know I should be ending soon, so I'm going to skip this and I'm going to just bring up the point that when we were looking at all of these processes in these populations and we were thinking about them comparatively, of course the legal context, the political context had a very strong impact. So when we compare Spain to the United States, Spain is a much more welcoming context to immigrants than is the United States. However, we see that a lot of this precarity associated with being an immigrant and the fears associated with this, also the fears associated with coming back home because of different and these worsening living conditions that we were describing earlier, it was very important to keep in mind how, again, these inequalities that were moving, right, with them or despite of them, where they are, and they had still this weight that affected their well-being and the well-being of their relatives. And with that, I'll end and I'll answer questions if you're still curious. Thank you.
other UN experience includes a role as Chief of Mission for the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Belgrade from 2001 to 2003. Prior to joining the UN, he was a deputy chair of the Hong Kong Refugee Status Review Board after working as a lawyer in New Zealand specializing in refugee and human rights issues. So please join me in welcoming Richard Towle.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. It's not fun being fifth after such esteemed panelists, but thank you very much. I wanted to acknowledge, first of all, Hannah and all your efforts in convening this important meeting, and also for the presentations of my fellow panelists this afternoon. It's really a great pleasure to be here, but I think we're confronting one of the most serious social evils of the world today, and that is the attitude towards forced migrants and refugees who, through no fault of their own, have found themselves often living in another country, but there become the focus of vilification, xenophobia and racism. And our High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, appeared in front of the Security Council only 2 weeks ago, and he said to the Security Council, this is the place where the global agenda of peace and security is set. He said never in his 3.5 decades of working for refugees all around the world has he seen such a level of toxicity towards refugees in national public debate. And that's deeply worrying, because it is like a mirror reflective of the state of societies, and often how one treats the stranger or the Jere is a reflection or a mirror of the sophistication, civilization of a society. So the more exclusive, the more xenophobic and the more racist we become, the more that reflects badly on the quality and inclusivity of the societies that we reflect. So what I really wanted to do from a refugee perspective is really pose the question, how is it that an essentially humanitarian system has found itself in the place that it has in the 21st century? How is it being recharacterized as a threat to security, as a threat to identity, when really what it is a crisis of individual lives. Through the no fault of people's lives, they find themselves forced to flee from everything that they hold dear to themselves, and they find themselves in another place through no fault of their own, and they're asking for help and assistance. So how is it? In a few minutes available to me, I'll try to perhaps outline very briefly the international legal system. There were some comments before about the Global Compact on Migration. There is a very well-developed system of international law to provide for refugees. It is an exceptionalist agreement by states, very well organized and very well agreed, that refugees are not migrants. Refugees are not people who volunteer to cross over international borders to seek family reunification or betterment of their lives. They have no choice but to escape and flee very severe consequences to their life and security. So there is an internationally agreed definition and system for dealing with refugees that recognizes that refugees don't line up in front of consulates and embassies to get visas. They don't wait patiently in a queue to be invited to cross a border to go somewhere else. They are like someone in a fire in the house, trying to get out of whatever window or door they possibly can. And that is the, if I can use that metaphor, that is what refugees experience, is they face hell on earth, and the only way that they can find safety for their families and their loved ones and themselves is to violate international national laws of migration. So to be a refugee requires you, almost by definition, to violate well-established principles of national integrity and border integrity. So immediately you find this conflict between the humanitarian imperative of finding safety and security, the humanitarian imperative of states providing sanctuary to that situation, and yet overlaid on top of that is this very sophisticated creature of state sovereignty, which is almost antithetical to the situation of being a refugee. So we have a 1951 Convention on Refugees and a protocol that updates and expands it in 1967. The United States is a signatory to the 1967 protocol, which accepts that refugees who show up at the border are entitled to have their claims assessed, and if they are refugees, they're entitled to protection for as long as they need it. And I think Jojo gave a definition of what a refugee is. In other parts of the world, there are more sophisticated definitions of a refugee. In Latin America, In Africa, there are definitions which are wider, which accept that if you flee from serious human rights violations, from conflict, various man-induced or man-caused catastrophes, then you can also engage the international system of protection. The global compact of migration, which we heard about from our esteemed colleague this afternoon, is matched by another compact called the Global Compact on Refugees, and that was almost universally agreed to by the General Assembly in December of last year. There is broad agreement amongst states about the principles of asylum and the legal conditions of asylum. And yet, on a daily basis, we see those agreed principles being violated. We have today, sadly, about 68.5 million people who have been forcibly displaced from their homes by virtue of conflict. This is not natural disasters, this is man-induced disasters. Wars, conflicts, persecution, violations of human rights have caused untold misery. And we see it every day of the week, don't we, when we open the newspapers, when we turn on our television sets, or we access international media. We see the horrors of mass displacement in its true shape and form. 86%, and this figure is not well known, 86% of the world's displaced people, the world's displaced refugees, are in the low-income or middle-income countries of the world today, just across the borders from where they fled frequently, and that's where they are. The real burden and responsibility for looking after the world's displaced people today is borne on the shoulders of countries that are doing their best to look after their own societies, and often, most usually, offer a hand of friendship to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. Not because they have to, but because they think it's the right thing to do. The huge camps in Kakuma in Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, the enormous generosity that you find in the Middle East, in Jordan and in Lebanon towards the Syrian people, is unmatched in the history of mankind. The cost in social terms to having a large number of people in your own country is enormous, and yet they bear it without complaint. So we don't understand, I think, enough that the real burden, the real problem, the real challenge lies very, very far away from the countries which make often the most noise about refugees today. Countries which live fortunate because of geography, and I'm from New Zealand, I know this very well, we're a long way, thank goodness, we're a long way from the places of conflict today. Often you find the most draconian and the toughest border security and national security sovereignty arguments in those places, not in the places where refugees are. Who is talking about putting up walls? Who is increasingly raising the difficulties for people to cross borders? It's in Europe. It's here. It's in countries which have highly sophisticated, very privileged societies, and yet still fall into the trap, if I might use that word, of trying to find reasons, legal, physical, and social reasons why people shouldn't be allowed to cross over that border. And they're very creative. Countries and states today are extremely creative in creating these edifices of exclusion. And that is, as I said, as an antithesis to what the spirit often is within the countries themselves, and it's an antithesis to the rule of law on which the whole spirit of refugee protection is based. So the nature of conflict that we face today is changing. No longer do two countries face off across contested territory. We don't see contestations these days in conflict over territory. We see it over populations. We see it over power. But we don't, as much as we did 50 years ago, see it over territory and borders. Conflict has become increasingly nasty. We heard a little about international humanitarian law, which is really an acceptance by the international system that wars will always be the most brutal way of resolving or exercising politics. But the purpose of international humanitarian law is really to try and soften the edges or the brutality that often goes with war. And yet today, war is increasingly brutal. Women and children are not collateral damage in conflict. Women and children are now the direct targets and strategies and tactics of conflict itself. Mass rape is not men taking advantage of women's vulnerability. or men taking advantage of men's vulnerability. There's rape across whole populations. It is about the tactics and strategies often of conflict itself. And how do you deal with that? How do you respond to that? Not by bombing, not by military force, but by getting back into the very ideas of love for one's neighbor, respect for dignity, respect for difference, and inclusivity. The best way to counter these odious practices of terrorism these days is by including societies, not excluding them. So the conflicts that we face are increasingly difficult to deal with. The responsibility is increasingly shoved and pushed back onto countries that are finding it difficult to cope. What really do we have there to work with? What are the solutions and approaches? Well, there are no, like any of the global challenges today, whether it's climate change or any other social issue that we're facing, they're not easy. But everything starts with what we do at home, what we do across the dining room table, what we do in our families, what we do in our communities, what we say and do in our religious groups, the leadership that we show about respect for others, the inclusivity and the dignity that we show towards others starts at home, literally. And leadership is incredibly important. Often we defer leadership to somebody else. It has to be our president or our prime minister. It has to be our political leaders. But leadership starts truly, as it does, at home through good practices. It starts in places like this, where you have good debates, and I hope if you hear good things here, if you hear important things, you take those messages. We're not here for fun. We're here to look at complex challenges. Take the issues that you hear and take them out and work with them.
What can I say? What can I share that is going to be interesting to the audience of 600-700 educators gathered in 2015? At that time, again, I'm reminding you, this is the time of President Obama. And then I came across this book by Dennis Spellberg, which was titled Thomas Jefferson Quran, Islam and the Founders. Interesting. So what is the book about? The book pretty much talks about this dialogue that is happening among founding fathers. At that time, after Jefferson buys the holy book of Quran, and Jefferson at that time, I'm quoting now, Jefferson could imagine Muslims as future citizens of his new nation, even though they were then deemed to be the ultimate outsiders in Western society and not even known to exist in the colonies. Jefferson and a few other exceptional founding fathers created an unprecedented, uniquely American model of religious pluralism and universal citizenship that would encompass not only the future Muslims, but also contemporary religious minorities such as Catholics and Jews, who were despised at that time. The contentious public debate concerning inclusion of Muslims set the parameters of religious freedom and civic inclusion for all non-Protestants, ultimately leading to the decision not to establish a Protestant nation in America. Thus, Jefferson's founding ideal of inclusive citizenship for Muslims became the essential historical backdrop for today's national framework of integration for immigrants, for Muslims, and other religious groups. The framework of integration that we had till we got our new president traced its roots to that contentious debate. And I contrasted that paradigm, that framework, with what was happening in Europe, and why were Muslims so alienated, and why they were doing this horrendous act, that we were lucky, we were blessed. And at that time, The Economist magazine had the cover issue, and the issue was, why were Muslims doing so well in America? And essentially saying that they were well integrated and prospering. So my friends, this is our grain. This is our ideal. This is our backdrop. So what is happening today is against that grain. And what is happening today is against the logic of globalization. Globalization is about global interdependence. Sovereignty in the age of globalization is altered, it is shared. You don't come and claim national sovereignty, America first, because you're not going to prosper, you're not going to do well. You have to realize that we are in that shared enterprise. So, you know, it's, that was 2015, and how much can change in a couple of years. But I'm with Richard when he showed his appreciation for the kind of diversity that we have in America. If any of you have looked at research by the year 2040 or 45, that diversity explosion that we have, if it is not severely arrested and reversed, is going to produce not any majority, the minorities will become the majority. So we'll have a more gorgeous mosaic of diversity here. I conclude by giving you an observation. So yesterday I was at Industry City, which is a hub of innovation and knowledge economy in Brooklyn. And then after that, my president calls me that I should go to Brooklyn Navy Yard because he was visiting there and I should join. And there's a new lab there that is the incubator for all that innovation, disruptive technologies that really improve health, improve life, and make our society much better. So I'm in Industry City, and I'm going through spaces. 1/3 to 1/2 of entrepreneurs, people are immigrants. Go to Brooklyn Navy Yard, to New Lab, this gorgeous place, almost half of them are immigrants. So, you know, we could have a national rhetoric about exclusion, about othering, about politics of fear, but reality is that diversity is continuing and immigrants are making magnificent contribution to this nation that we love. And that is the America that I believe in, and I hope that we'll return to it. Thank you so much for this incredible presentations.